A blurred region in the heart of vastness, far from earth and heaven, with no ground underfoot, no vault of sky overhead, nothing. I am the prisoner of an alien matter, and my body is clothed in a dead, formless substance. Or rather, I have no body. I am that alien matter. Hey everyone, welcome back to my novel review, the Book Podcast. If you are a lover of literature, thanks so much for clicking on, and you are in the right place because every week I review a different book. This week, of course, being no different. I am reviewing Stanisław Lem's Solaris. I'll hold it up for the benefit of those on YouTube. This was a recommendation from a listener, and it was a very, very thought-provoking novel. I really kind of enjoyed it for that aspect, but I'll speak more about that in a second. We don't want to get too much ahead of ourselves. First, I just want to say thanks so much for clicking on. I really do appreciate it. If you're returning to the podcast, thanks so much. I appreciate your continued attention. I really, really love and enjoy it. If you would like to like and subscribe, please feel free. If you're listening to this through your ears in more traditional podcasting realms, then please do hit the 5 stars and the follow button. I also really appreciate that. I hope everyone is well. I hope everyone has some great books on their to be read piles. I hope it is always growing and never ending. And yeah, the good books just keep coming, really. So enough from me jabbering about that. Let's get on to the book. Okay, Solaris, Stanisław Lem, written in 1961. It was translated by 2 people, which I did find interesting, by Johanna Kilmartin and Steve Cox. Really fascinating story. Recommendation from a listener, and I sort of purchased a copy and had it there, and then sort of had a spare week on the pod in terms of book schedules and different books, and thought, yeah, why not? Let's jump into that. And I'm really, really glad I read it for 2 reasons. One is I read it straight after reading this book, The Midnight Project by Christy, Clemenhage, which I will be doing an episode on next week. And basically, the reason I sort of loved reading these 2 books back to back is that they both felt quite similar in that they were both exploring sort of untempered scientific expansion, science rationalism, sort of the limits of science, the expansion, the expansive nature of science, and then of course the question as to what is a human? What classifies a human? What makes us human? These really kind of big philosophical questions that are always really fun to, I guess, speak about, ask about, talk about, and explore, especially through literature, because it gives us wonderful stories. So I really enjoyed reading these 2 books back to back, both are sci-fi. Sci-fi, I wouldn't say is my absolute favorite topic. I would definitely always go for a fantasy novel over sci-fi, but that's just because I prefer fantasy. There's nothing wrong with that. And I think actually that's where I'll start, is that I think the reason I had a little bit of hesitancy coming into this book is because it was a sci-fi, or it is a sci-fi book, and it was written in 1961. And I don't read a lot of sci-fi, so maybe this is an unfair opinion or an unfair statement, is I feel like sci-fi runs the risk of eventually becoming outdated because it is essentially trying to, for the purpose of being science fiction, almost explore things within our own future, within our own humanistic future, that it eventually runs the risk, especially technologically, of eventually being overtaken by the actual society that we live in, and therefore the story could feel quite dated. And then I guess, yeah, thinking about this book being released in 1961, I thought maybe the expansive ideas of someone from 1961 could not possibly predict where we would be in 2025, and therefore the story might feel incredibly dated. I think there's a vast irony with that, because this book did not feel dated at all. It felt like it could have easily been written this year. And then I think the vast irony comes is that this is essentially a story about humanity's limitations and inability to reach beyond the human, and yeah, basically the limitations that humans carry with them. And so me thinking that this book was going to be perhaps a little dated and not as expansive as it could be if it was written today, had a very limited human view, which was then completely proven wrong about a story discussing the limitations of the human psyche, I guess. And I just kind of found that all kinds of funny, because yeah, it was an incredibly fresh novel. Like I said, this easily could have been written this year. I thought it was wonderful. A very different take on what an alien is as well, and I found that really fascinating. And then of course delving into what is a human ultimately. A brief overview first though. This is a story about Chris Kelvin, the scientist who comes to a space station that is orbiting the planet Solaris. And the planet Solaris is covered in a vast ocean, and the ocean is sentient, which is, what I mean by a completely different take on the alien within a story, because I think whenever we think of aliens, we think of more or less projections of humans. And in this, it's actually like, let's just make a body of water sentient and the alien. And then the story from there is all about the deterioration of the mental psyche of everyone on the space station. There's only 3 men on the space station at this stage, including Chris Kelvin. And then it all becomes kind of spooky when there are projections of people from each individual scientist's past lives that materialize and start to haunt them, is probably a word you could use, but partake in their lives, even though some of these characters are deceased individuals. So it makes for a really interesting, spooky kind of story. I'll speak about that as well, kind of the genre of the story, which I found really fascinating, but that is kind of a brief overview. It's about these more or less 3 characters, more or less Chris Kelvin as the scientist, trying to understand what the hell is going on, because this is a sentient ocean, and now we've suddenly got, in Chris Kelvin's case, his former dead lover projected back to him and seemingly alive and well. I think the first half of this story was absolutely fantastic. It was brilliant. I thought it really set up the story. Chris Kelvin arrives at this space station and there has been a suicide, and the other 2 scientists, the 2 remaining scientists, are completely on edge. They are very reclusive. They're incredibly paranoid. And so when Chris enters this sort of atmosphere, this situation, he feels almost immediately completely isolated. He's incredibly confused, and he can't really understand why these other scientists are being so reclusive within themselves and so paranoid. And almost immediately you feel like the story is no longer a sci-fi story. You feel like it is this kind of horror story that is unfolding, and then it kind of progresses from there. And I think that was one of the aspects I found most interesting, was the story went a completely different way, not necessarily in storyline, although the storyline of course drives the plot forward. It went a completely different way to what I was expecting, in that I thought it was going to be this very interesting, I knew it was kind of psychological, but I thought it was going to be a bit different in terms of sci-fi, but really it just becomes this almost existential horror story. It just went a completely different direction, and to the point that it actually took me a bit of time to realize what the story was actually doing within itself. And it's not a story about sort of humans contacting aliens and making contact with aliens, and there's something existential in that sort of situation, but it becomes a story of humans just trying to understand themselves and understanding the limitations of science rationalism that's going on within the story. And I think because it took me a bit of time to actually realize that that's the direction the story was going, I probably didn't pay as good attention to those particular parts very early in the story, and I might have actually missed something. That's okay, because I think this book is definitely a reread kind of book. If I had to criticize this book at all, it would be saying that there are a few chapters that are difficult to read because they are heavily coded in scientific jargon and just trying to explain very scientific themes. And look, as someone that doesn't have any kind of scientific understanding really, they felt incredibly real. I mean, you could say anything and I'd probably believe it, but it felt incredibly scientific, and it felt like it wasn't just completely made up. Like, it really did feel like it was based in genuine scientific research, and that Stanisław Lem had actually done his research when it comes to something like this. But I think that is kind of the point of it, is that it is incredibly confusing. And I think what I loved about that, and it's again a sort of another humorous thing, is this more or less the story is about humans' inability to understand and make sense of this ocean, because we so often project ourselves into other things, and we want to find ourselves in something, and that's how we pretty much more or less define things, is how we see ourselves within those things. And because we can't understand or see ourselves within this ocean as a sentient being, it's almost too difficult to comprehend that an ocean could be sentient. It becomes almost impossible to understand from a human perspective. And I think I love that, because the story then kind of flips and it changes from being this story about how do we process sort of our understanding of the ocean to becoming this story about how do we process ourselves as human beings. And you can't really, at least they can't really do it within the story, and it becomes really confusing. And I think myself reading this story not understanding the scientific aspects of this novel turned it into this kind of vast joke where I'm now reflecting upon myself, and it was just all kinds of kind of trying to, I guess, find sort of humor within the text, because those chapters were, quite difficult to read. I did really struggle with them because, they were just incredibly high level science, and I just do not have that kind of brain. But I guess that's kind of the point of it as well. So as I just touched upon, one of the main central themes of this story is the inability to classify this ocean in a scientific framework, a humanistic scientific framework. It's really difficult to classify it and dissect it and digest it and understand it, because we as humans, I guess, look for ourselves within those discoveries that we're making. And I've got a quote here that I'm going to read, which kind of more or less sums it up. So I'll read the quote and then I'll continue talking. We don't want to conquer the cosmos. We simply want to extend the boundaries of Earth to the frontiers of the cosmos. For us, such and such a planet is as arid as the Sahara, another as frozen as the North Pole, and yet another as lush as the Amazon basin. We are humanitarian and chivalrous. We don't want to enslave other races. We simply want to bequeath them our values and take over their heritage in exchange. We think of ourselves as the knights of the holy contact. This is another lie. We are only seeking man. We have no need of other worlds. We need mirrors. And the reason I think that quote pretty much more or less sums it up is because of those few lines there. I mean, well, the ending there is, of course, perfect. We don't need other worlds. We need mirrors, because it's all about sort of, we need to understand ourselves more comprehensively before we start trying to classify other things. But the way Stanisław Lem sums it up here, such and such a planet is as arid as the Sahara, another as frozen as the North Pole, and yet as lush as the Amazon basin. And it's that way that we as humans in this particular universe, and of course within our own lives, would look at something and immediately try and classify it as to something we would understand. So you'd see a desert, and if you've been to the Sahara, you'd be like, oh, that desert reminds me of the Sahara. So you immediately place humanistic limitations of what you can perceive and understand within yourself on this new experience in front of you. And I found that really, really fascinating, because it kind of captures the limits and the limits of scientific rationalism and the limits of human expansion, and of course trying to understand something within a humanistic scientific framework. And then wrapped up in all this kind of wonderful scientific metaphysical exploration is, of course, the visitors, these projections that the scientists start to see, that Chris Kelvin starts to see, and that he starts to see the materialization of his former lover in that it's a woman that unfortunately committed suicide, and that he feels really guilty about, because he feels like he played a prominent part within that suicide. And so it's something that is, of course, in his mind, and of course he feels guilty about, and is always plaguing him in some way, even if he's not, I guess, consciously aware of it at that particular moment. She materializes and becomes this character that he interacts with, and it becomes this wonderful story. I guess it's kind of like these scientists are trying to uncover and explore and understand what Solaris is, this planet, and really it's Solaris just projecting back these visitors to the men to be like, you don't even understand yourselves. Here are these projections that I've taken from the insides of your mind to basically reveal to you how you as humans have limitations and can't move beyond the bounds of your own understanding. And it's that inability to move forward as individuals that really limits the human capacity for expansion, that I think made it this incredibly fascinating story. And it's the kind of book that I would have loved to have done. I say at high school only because that was really the only time in life when you properly dissected a book. I don't know what it is like in the rest of the world and other education programs across the world. But in Australia, in your senior years at high school, you spend a term, so 10 weeks on one particular text. So one term I did Hamlet, another term I did Frankenstein, and you spend these 10 weeks on that one book. So you actually get a chance to read the book, and then every class is, tearing it apart line by line, chapter by chapter. And this is a kind of book that would really benefit something like that, the ability, the opportunity to really tear it apart, strip it back to its bones, and to try and understand what it's doing and what it's telling us as humans. Because like I said, it's from 1961 and it still feels incredibly fresh and incredibly relevant. And, we're trying so hard to, further society in different ways, in ways that we think are going to be incredibly beneficial for humans. But really, it's like we can't see can't see beyond the wood through the trees, or whatever that saying is. And it was just fascinating to read. And it's a book I definitely want to read again. Like I said, there are those dense chapters that I think made it a little bit difficult to read, but I think it was just so fresh and so interesting. And like I said, I kind of didn't understand where the story was going, but I think a second read would be incredibly beneficial to really hone in and focus on the metaphysical exploration that this story is going through, and trying to understand how these men sort of deteriorate so quickly in this situation where they are confronted with these visitors and images from their own past, and captures their own inability to move on from certain things, while also trying to conquer the universe and place these humanistic ideals and definitions on things that we can't necessarily perceive. So it was a fascinating story. Really, really fascinating story. I really was quite blown away. And like I said, it was wonderful to read with Christy Clemenhage, The Midnight Project, because I think that does similar things as well, in that it explores our own humanity and what it means to be human. And, I can't wait to now speak about that book. But it was just all kinds of fun. I think, it is relatively short, 215 pages. Those chapters that are quite difficult to read are dense, but you just take your time, read them slow, try your best to understand them. But ultimately, it's not essential that you understand those chapters for the overarching story. You've just got to get a grasp on that question as to what it means to be human, and understanding the limitations of humanistic scientific rationalism and how we have limits upon ourselves. So fascinating story. Really, really enjoyed it. Was really blown away by how fresh and relevant it feels. Stanisław Lem's Solaris. I'm going to rate this a 4.4 out of 5. Okay, normally I like to do a what am I reading right about now, but I'm going to actually briefly chat about The Midnight Project, Christy Clemenhage, which I will be doing next week, and just sort of the similarities and differences very, very briefly. This is a book about two scientists that get commissioned by a billionaire to create a human race that is being merged with marine life. The world that they are living in is not too distant from our world, in that there is a vast ecological collapse going on, and the world is more or less ending. And this billionaire is like, what is going to solve this is if humans take on marine properties and become a water-based or a marine-based life form. And so these two scientists get to work on trying to codify and understand the DNA of both, and combine them and create a race of proto-humans that can survive underwater in order to preserve the human race and everything that comes with it. So the billionaire mostly talks about Shakespeare and all these kind of like wonderful cultural things that we have that need to be preserved beyond the immediate. And it becomes this wonderful story of, the morals and ethics surrounding that. Of course, what then is the definition of a human, and everything that flows from that. And then, of course, billionaires are tricky people to deal with sometimes. So wonderful story. Can't wait to talk about that. That is coming next week. Christy Clemenhage's The Midnight Project. Fantastic little story. Well, here we are at the end of the episode. Thanks so much for listening all the way to the end. I greatly do appreciate it. If you would like to like and subscribe, I would also greatly appreciate that. But as always, just thanks so much for listening. I appreciate your attention, and I hope everyone has a good day. So let's close out with a quote that more or less sums up the podcast. This is from T.S. Eliot, The Hollow Men. And as I said, it pretty much sums up the podcast in that this is not the way the podcast ends, not with a bang, but with a whimper.